this is Lady Boulay, and welcome back to Black American Lineage. Thank you for your support. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Thank you for viewing the channel. Thank you for your comments, and thank you for your thumbs up. Thank you for what you do to support the channel. Today, I want to introduce you to Robert Abbott. You may have heard of him, and if you haven't heard of him, you've probably heard of his newspaper, the Chicago Defender. Robert Abbott is one of those early activists, a man who came from the slave system or whose parents came from the slave system, but hit the ground running. Now, you know that the propaganda against black people began long before slavery ended. So there was a lot of propaganda, a lot of misinformation about black people, a lot of stereotypes, a lot of mockery, a lot of that kind of stuff going on all the time. Robert Abbott was one of those people who was going to set the record straight. There were always black people who wanted to set the record straight, all the way to Carter G. Woodson, who started Black History Month because he wanted to document the accomplishments of black Americans and let the world know that the stereotypes, all these lies that you've heard about us are just that. They're lies, they're propaganda, it's indoctrination to try to turn the world against a race of people who really hadn't done anything to anybody. But Robert Abbott is one of the ancestors that stands out to me because he saw the problems that black people were facing and he did something about it. He did the best that he could to address the problems in the way that he could, and that was through a newspaper that would circulate throughout the city and throughout the country. Robert Sangstack Abbott, publisher of the Chicago Defender. Abbott was born in Georgia on November 24th, 1870. His parents, Thomas and Flora Abbott, were both formerly enslaved people. Abbott's father died when he was young, and his mother remarried John Sangstack, a German immigrant. Abbott attended Hampton Institute in 1892, where he studied printing as a trade. While attending Hampton, Abbott toured with the Hampton Quartet, a group similar to the Fisk Jubilee Singers. He graduated in 1896, and 2 years later, he graduated from Kent College of Law in Chicago. Following law school, Abbott made several attempts to establish himself as an attorney in Chicago. Due to racial discrimination, he was unable to practice law, and that doesn't surprise us at all. In 1905, Abbott founded the Chicago Defender. With an investment of 25 cents, Abbott published the first edition of the Chicago Defender by using his landlord's kitchen to print copies of the paper. The first edition of the newspaper was an actual collection of news clippings from other publications as well as Abbott's reporting. So when you start with 25 cents, that is really pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. By 1916, the Chicago Defender's circulation was 50,000, and it was considered one of the best African American newspapers in the United States. Within 2 years, the circulation had reached 125,000, and by the early 1920s, it was well over 200,000. So that just means that there was an insatiable appetite by black people to read news about black people, just as it is today. Except today, the news doesn't come through newspapers, but mostly by social media. From the outset, Abbott employed yellow journalistic tactics, sensational headlines, and dramatic news accounts of African American communities. The paper's tone was militant. Writers referred to African Americans not as black or Negro, but as the race. Graphic images of lynchings, assaults, and other acts of violence against African Americans were published prominently in the paper. These images were not present to scare its readers, but rather to shed light on lynchings and other acts of violence that African Americans endured throughout the United States. Yeah, I don't call it yellow journalism when it's the truth. He was just telling people what was actually going on. Through its coverage of the Red Summer of 1919, The publication used these race riots to campaign for anti-lynching legislation. Now, Red Summer of 1919 was when like maybe 36 massacres took place across the United States. So he wrote about those. And he also campaigned for anti-lynching legislation. It took courage for him to do this now, because anytime you reported or talked about what was done, your life became at risk. As an African American news publisher, Abbott's mission was not only to print news stories, he had a 9-point mission that included: number one, American race prejudice must be destroyed. Number two, the opening up of all trade unions to blacks as well as white people. Number three, representation in the president's cabinet. Number four, engineers, firemen, and conductors on all American railroads and all jobs in government. Number five, representation in all departments of the police forces over the entire United States. Number six, government schools open to all American citizens in preference to foreigners. Number seven, motormen and conductors on surface, elevated, and motor bus lines throughout America. Number eight, federal legislation to abolish lynching. And number nine, full enfranchisement of all American citizens. Now, this man was a man before his time. Some of these are things that we're still having problems with today. And this man was talking about this in the 1920s. Now, where are visionaries today? This man was a visionary. He was successful and he had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, just like America tells you, but still he's got to advocate for Black Americans to become full citizens, because that's what this is all about. Effort to push the Great Migration forward, Abbott held an event on May 15, 1917, called the Great Northern Drive. The Chicago Defender published train schedules and job listings in its advertising pages, as well as editorials, cartoons, and news articles to persuade African Americans to relocate to northern cities. As a result of Abbott's depiction of the North, the Chicago Defender became known as the greatest stimulus that the migration had. And you know that there was a great migration from the South to the North, beginning in the 20s, I guess, but definitely in the 30s and the 40s. Black people leaving out of the South for better job and educational opportunities in the North. Once African Americans had reached northern cities, Abbott used the pages of the publication not only to show horrors of the South, but also the pleasantries of the North. So Abbott was a real civil rights activist, but he was also a community leader, so to speak. And I would add that Robert Abbott was also one of the sponsors of Bessie Coleman learning how to fly and becoming the first woman in the United States of America to fly an airplane. She flew before Amelia Earhart, and Robert Abbott was one of her greatest supporters and sponsors. So Robert Abbott was a great African American who we don't hear enough about, but he really did advance Black Americans during those teens and 20s and 30s. And he did quite well for himself too. This is the house that he owned in Chicago, and he died in 1940. So a life well lived, and to whom honor is due. So rest in peace, Robert Abbott. Thank you for listening. Let me know what you think about the video. Have a good evening.